Researchers are sounding a serious alarm about something many parents hardly think twice about: the role of processed foods in shaping eating patterns during early childhood. New evidence suggests that what toddlers and preschoolers are exposed to in the first few years of life may create long-lasting preferences that can persist into adolescence and adulthood, sometimes for decades. And unlike habits learned later in life, early dietary patterns are remarkably hard to reverse because they form during what scientists call critical windows of neurobiological and behavioral development. The warning is stark. Early exposure to processed foods may not just influence childhood snacking habits, but may carve deep grooves into the developing brain and palate, locking in patterns that increase lifelong susceptibility to unhealthy eating. To understand the concern, you first have to appreciate how sensitive the early childhood brain is. Between ages 1 and 5, neural circuits involved in taste perception, reward processing, and emotional regulation are rapidly wiring themselves. During this time, children are highly impressionable, both psychologically and biologically. Their taste buds are learning what normal food should feel like, and their reward systems are learning what kinds of flavors are worth seeking out. This is not an abstract process. It's physical, involving synapses forming and pruning, dopamine pathways calibrating, and sensory thresholds being established. Processed foods, with their exaggerated sweetness, intense saltiness, softened textures, and artificial flavors, can hijack these learning pathways. They teach children that food should be hyperstimulating, predictable, and instantly gratifying. The risk is that once a child becomes accustomed to these heightened sensory profiles, whole foods may start to seem boring, bland, or even unpleasant. If vegetables, lean proteins, and whole grains never get a chance to anchor themselves in a child's taste repertoire during the critical window, they may struggle to do so later. Adults often underestimate how profound this issue is. They assume children will simply grow out of picky eating or will eventually adapt to healthier foods with enough exposure. But research shows that early exposure matters far more than later efforts. When processed foods dominate the diet early on, the baseline expectations for sweetness, mouthfeel, and intensity are pushed upward, making normal foods feel like a letdown. It becomes an uphill battle for parents years later, when the child has already internalized their food preferences at a neurological level. The warnings become even more serious when we look at the behavioral implications. Early exposure to processed foods is linked to more emotional eating, increased susceptibility to food cues, and difficulties in self-regulation around snacks as children grow older. Kids who learn early that food is a source of fast comfort or excitement may struggle to differentiate hunger from emotional needs. This kind of conditioning takes hold easily in the developing brain, much faster than in adults, and can set the stage for overeating, stress eating, and reward-driven food choices that persist well into adulthood. Several long-term studies now show that even moderate exposure to sweetened processed foods in toddlerhood predicts lower vegetable intake, higher sugar cravings, and more frequent snacking many years later. One of the more troubling aspects is how quickly the food environment can overwhelm parental intentions. Many processed foods marketed for toddlers, puffs, bars, flavored yogurts, drinkable snacks, are framed as harmless or even healthy. But their design still relies on concentrated sugars, flavor enhancers, and ultra-soft textures that require little chewing. These features aren't accidental. They're engineered to make children prefer them over the more challenging flavors and textures of whole foods. Parents often turn to them out of convenience or because they appear kid-friendly, not realizing they may be unintentionally training a child's palate toward heightened stimulation. Once that preference takes hold, children may reject fresh foods not out of stubbornness, but because their sensory expectations have already been shaped. The long-term consequences can ripple across a child's entire life. Children who form early preferences for processed foods tend to enter adolescence with stronger reward-seeking tendencies around snacks and sugary beverages. They may have more difficulty with portion control, less sensitivity to natural satiety signals, and a persistent desire for foods that deliver rapid gratification. These patterns are linked to higher risks of obesity, insulin resistance, dental problems, and mood instability. But the psychological toll is just as concerning. Young people with entrenched processed food preferences are more likely to view healthy eating as a chore or punishment, making it harder to maintain balanced diets without constant struggle. What makes this issue so urgent is that the window for prevention is narrow. The first few years of life represent a developmental moment that will not come again. Once this period closes, taste preferences become more entrenched, reward circuits less plastic, and eating habits far more resistant to change. Parents, educators, and policymakers need to treat early childhood nutrition not as a minor lifestyle choice, but as a foundational investment in long-term health. And processed foods, even those marketed as toddler-friendly, carry risks that are far more serious than most people realize. The bottom line is unsettling but clear. Early childhood exposure to processed foods may shape eating patterns in ways that last a lifetime. The foods that enter a toddler's bowl aren't just fueling growth, they're sculpting neural pathways, shaping emotional associations, and wiring reward systems that will influence behavior for decades. The warnings from researchers should not be taken lightly. If society continues to normalize processed foods as standard fare for very young children, we may be locking in dietary patterns that undermine health long before children understand the choices being made for them.